Okay, this is the RFD for the demo debate for the APDA Summer Open. This will be a bit of a longer RFD, so I hope to give like a more comprehensive look at my thoughts on the round and how I evaluated it, because it's supposed to be educational. So I gave the round to Op on a pretty decisive margin. One thing before I get into the RFD is that I would have loved to see more characterization from both sides regarding what these human rights abuses actually look like in the median case. People that are debating this round like vaguely gesture at times towards like genocide as the thing they're talking about as a human rights abuse, and sometimes it seems like they're talking more about just like poor labor conditions. So I think that difference feels important, it feels meaningful, and it feels underexplored in the debate on a lot of levels, which leaves me slightly confused about some of the mechanization from both sides. But Op definitely had more direct and clean mechanization. So I was happy to vote for op in two places. First being recessions, second being an increase in repressive violence in the developing world. First, on the question of recessions. This is the first ballot in the LOR. As I understand it, the op claim on recessions is as follows. When MNCs pull out of developing nations, the economy in that nation will crash. There'll be lots of job loss, less capital in the system, etc. Therefore, there will be a domestic recession. When multiple domestic recessions are triggered across the developing world, a financial avalanche is triggered that destabilizes the entire global economy because all these countries, individual recessions impact all the countries that they supply, that they trade with, and so on. And the impact that op claims is like billions of people will starve and be plunged into the worst poverty imaginable. Just on face, I find myself slightly skeptical of the extent of the impact claimed here. I do buy that MNCs abruptly pulling out of developing nations can trigger domestic financial hardship in those countries, but I'm not sure Op does the legwork to prove this link will cause like a global financial contagion that causes billions to starve to death. That being said, Gov doesn't really do the legwork to point that out, so I'm left in a position where I likely am going to just credit Op with the impacts of domestic recessions and some regional economic instability, but not like literal starvation of billions of people. Um, so yeah, the Gov pushback to the recession claim is twofold. First, Gov says in PMR that Ops claim on recessions makes no sense because per Ops' own characterization that MNCs have tons of different viable countries where they could set up operations in the developing world. So like if they're impacted by regulations in one country, they'll just move to another country in the worst case scenario, thus avoiding recessions. Even if I'm being very charitable to that response and I decline to evaluate the POO, I still don't think it's super interactive with the op mechanism. Sure, a company doing business in country A might pick up and move to country B, thus improving country B's economy, but the odd claim was really more about how the uncontested domestic recession is caused in country A and how that recession could spiral in such a way as to plunge entire regions into economic crisis. Additionally, presumably country A was reliant on those MNCs to some degree to not be in recession. Both sides agree on this, which means that company is still comparatively more useful in stopping financial crisis if it remains located in the initial country instead of moving. So I don't really buy this response from Gov. Secondly, and more importantly, the second and more important way that Gov tries to like push back on this recession ballot, this is like most of the MG, is by pointing out that recessions only happen if companies actually leave. So if Gov wins, the developing nations will simply improve their human rights abuses preemptively when they are warned of the incoming regulatory action, or will avoid going down the path into human rights abuses in the first place. That would obviously minimize and uplayer the op claim on recessions to a pretty high degree. My issue with this attempt from Gov is that there are, by my count, like 11 different mechanisms in the op case for why these developing nations lack either the incentive, capacity, or both to end their human rights abuses. And I simply don't think Gov is close to winning the line by line on how those mechanisms don't make sense or why those mechanisms wouldn't apply. To be sure, there's Gov pushback on some of these things. That's very good. But just like in totality, all 11 of these things are pretty overwhelming for the Gov. So the different mechanisms were firstly that regimes lack the capacity to stop human rights abuses because these things are systemic and there's no individual political actor with the power to stop them. Secondly, that those in power will stake their political identity on these human rights abuses and therefore they'll never be willing to stop them even if they could because they lose power. Thirdly, those human rights abuses are necessary for the regime to function. Fourthly, those in power will simply continue the human rights abuses but hide them better. Fifthly, MNCs won't go back into the countries even if the human rights abuses stop, meaning those in power lack any incentive to stop them. Sixthly, those in power will react to these regulations by blaming the West and initiating a rally around the flag to consolidate power and prey on anti-Western sentiment. Seventh, that these countries' human rights abuses are often carried out by militias or militaries or other groups like that who would threaten to coup those in power if they attempted to crack down on them. Eighthly, these human rights abuses are often carried out across thousands of miles of land, and there's simply logistical difficulties in locating where the abuses are taking place or who specifically is enacting them. Ninthly, that those in power do not trust the West international governing bodies, so they will simply assume the new legislation is a manipulation tactic and ignore it. Tenthly, that oligarchs will encourage those in power to keep the MNCs out because oligarchs benefit from domestic industries gaining comparative influence and market share. And 11th, and most importantly, China, Russia, and similar actors like that will just fill the financial void left by the Western MNCs leaving. And yeah, don't get me wrong, Gov has lots of good responses to many of these claims. For example, as MG notes, accountability mechanisms are pretty good. There's plenty of watchdog organizations, and there must be some way of tracking these abuses for the regulations to exist in the first place, which means I buy they probably cannot just hide the abuses better and avoid all regulation. And I also struggle to credit the op fully with their claim that no single individual in power can control whether or not human rights abuses continue, or that like leaders in the developing nations are never willing to negotiate and would view these policies as a manipulation tactic to ignore completely. So there's certainly Gulf pushback, but that being said, I think the op is actually convincingly winning the three most important of the defensive claims they make, and I'll go through each of them. Firstly, op is very much ahead on the China and Russia stuff. There's basically nothing in the Gov case that contests this besides like a throwaway line in the PMC vaguely stating that like Russia doesn't have money right now because of the Ukraine war or something like that. Mo correctly notes that it doesn't take that much capital to like, do economic interventions or investments in like Burkina Faso or in Venezuela, lining the pockets of the elite in these nations, or even doing more significant investment like China has a revealed preference to do, is likely well within the budget of these actors. The other way Gov can try to get around this China-Russia thing is by appealing to the part of the PMR that says, well, actually, this debate was not really about stopping existing human rights abuses, and instead it's more about preemptively stopping countries from heading down that like dark path in the first place. But to me, it seems intuitive that if a country wants to do human rights abuses, and they know that doing so would push Western MNCs away, but would incur massive and less restrictive investment from Russia and China in the short term, they would simply be even more encouraged to do those human rights abuses. Um, to get that money in the short term and to access more valuable trade partners who will put less restrictions on them, in the first place. And China and Russia obviously have the incentive to harm the West comparatively in the global economic order, so they're going to invest. Notably, it's also uncontested out of the MO that Western MNCs at least possess some desire to rein in human rights abuses, whether that be like, marketing reasons, like the, free trade coca or other international regulatory standards, whereas China and Russia will actively encourage these things to continue because they're going to tell these people, well, look, like the West are demons. They want to change your way of life. We're not going to make you change any of the things that you're doing, and we're going to give you money anyways. So obviously, the developing nations are going to go with those actors instead, which means there's just no incentive for the countries to not cut down on the human rights abuses. In fact, there may even be an incentive for them to increase them. Secondly, there's just no response to the top of the MO that says these companies just won't re-enter these developing nations, even if the human rights abuses decrease, because they fear future regulation, because investors are risk averse, because there are other countries they can turn to, etc. Which means these developing nations won't actually listen to the West and stop their abuses because the capital flight is just going to happen regardless. And thirdly, a lot of the MO material on civil wars, coups, and the way human rights abuses and the median regime in the developing world actually function are like pretty untouched and quite compelling, which means I'm further questioning the capacity of these developing nations to actually cut back on human rights abuses, even if the incentive did exist. At this point, I believe Gov lacks meaningful offense on human rights abuses decreasing in the developing world, and I give the round to op on a lighter version of the recession ballot, which still means lots and lots of people will become comparatively worse off than before because the domestic economy is hurt, because there's lots of regional economic instability that causes lower wages, less jobs. Some amount of people are pushed into food insecurity. Some amount of people will maybe starve because of that. Probably not billions, but like maybe hundreds of thousands. Lastly, I also would secondarily say that OP is winning the ballot on violence, actively worsening in the developing world. There's relatively uncontested material from both OP speakers that tells me domestic financial hardship causes an increase in violence and repression because when people are less well off, the government must necessarily use more violent coercion to keep the citizenry compliant because people are more disgruntled and more demanding of change. There's a line or two in the MG and PMR that just says popular uprising is good because authoritarianism is bad, but like this is missing way too much mechanization to properly defeat the op claim. Additionally, because the regime must now extract more money from the populace in the form of taxes and extortion because they have less money as a regime, when times are economically rough, they will then use violence more often as a mechanism to enforce those things. And lastly, the Emma Wang, that authoritarian nations prefer using bribery and economic coercion over violence because it's easier, because it's more legitimate, etc. But they must now turn to actual violence when the government has a lot less money because they can't do that economic coercion anymore when they have less capital. Gov also doesn't contest that the military is the first thing to get funded on both sides of the house, and that regimes will now use the military to crack down violently on its citizens, as now the military is their only vector of societal control, whereas before they could also do economic control when they had comparatively more money. So yeah, give the round to op for those reasons. Thought it was an interesting debate. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you're excited for the summer open. If anyone has any questions about the round or anything else, feel free to message me on Facebook.